And turn to Romans 12, verse 2. You might recall I used this passage this morning. I was thinking about this passage quite a bit actually throughout the week for a couple of different reasons. But as I was thinking about this passage, I began to think about my wife's cousin. He's actually from Toledo, Ohio. And he had a very Northwestern style accent. And around the age of, I guess, 18 or 19, he moved down to Louisiana. And I saw him a few years after he'd moved, and when I began to talk to him, he looked the same, but when I began to talk to him, I couldn't understand him. And the reason was, as he lived down there in Louisiana, he conformed to the culture around him, and in essence, he spoke and acted just like they did. Well, similar things happen, unfortunately, to those who are Christians, and that's why we're constantly warned in a number of areas in the Scriptures not to conform to this world. And that's the passage that we look at right before us here in Romans 12:2. Paul said, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Certainly we ought to ask ourselves, are we conforming to the world that we live in? Are we weighed down by the things that are occurring around us in the world? Are we even guilty of worldliness? And I think when you begin to ask people that question, whether they are conforming to this world, there's a few different responses. I think some would respond with a resounding no. I don't believe that in any way I am conforming to the world around me. I think there are some that would say, I don't think that I am, or I hope that I'm not. And I think there are some that might even say, I'm not sure if I fully comprehend the idea of worldliness or what would be involved in that. And so as I bring that up, I say all that to say that the goal of a Christian is to be able to figure out what worldliness is and what it is, and how we as Christians need to refrain from that. And with all that being said, the goal of a Christian is to be pleasing to God. And so I thought a lot about that, because I'll be honest with you, I'm still studying a number of topics myself, but my goal is I do want to be pleasing to God. So those are things I've got to get figured out. Go ahead and turn to 1 John 2. We're going to look at verses 15 through 17. And there's a reason that I've chosen this passage. This passage really breaks down a couple of categories of things that occur in the world which we as Christians would not want to be involved in. So we'll spend just a couple of minutes on this passage. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. We're warned, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. And if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, notice here, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. If we begin to think about the world around us that we as Christians live in, I think we can take virtually every sinful thing that exists, and we can really place it in one of these three categories that we see here in verse 16. So I'm going to mention these categories, and I'll just lightly touch on each of them. He starts off here in verse 16 talking about the lust of the flesh. It's actually a very interesting topic if you begin to study it or even look at the concept of the lust of the flesh pertaining to religion. There are many today who think that anything related to the human body is sinful. I know that there are those who would claim to be Christians today that think a number of things that pertain to the body are sinful. They're not much different than the Gnostics in the first century. If you recall, there were the Gnostics, that word meaning knowing. They didn't believe, many of them, that Jesus Christ could have been the Messiah. And the reason was because he had a human body. The Gnostics believed that anything pertaining to a human body was sinful, and therefore he couldn't be deity in the flesh. Some thought that possibly he didn't even have a real body, that he was the Messiah, but the body was not a real body, and the idea was they could try to disassociate him with sin. So you've had some that think anything related to the body is sinful. You have some today who don't think that anything related to the body is sinful. The idea meaning that there is no such thing as morality, and therefore a person could be involved in anything and not sin. I bring all that up to say that that certainly the Bible says, though, that there is a thing called the lust of the flesh. But with that being said, we have to remember when it comes to the human body, there is a balance, okay? God has given us certain desires which in and of themselves are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with those. But He also has warned us. I'll just give you one of the warnings. I'm going to read from Proverbs 23, 20 through 21. He says, "Be not among wine-bibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh, for the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags." Well, I began to think about this passage here, although it doesn't cover all of the lust of the flesh. It covers a couple of things, and it would be good to look at. So we understand that drink is good and natural, right? I love my unsweet tea. Yet I have to contrast that with understanding what he says here, that drunkenness and alcohol would be sinful. There's nothing wrong with being thirsty, but there is something that is wrong with using that thirst in a sinful way, right? There's a balance there. He also talks about food. Food is good and natural. Each of us get hungry every day, yet there's a distinction and a contrast made between that which would be gluttony, overeating and stuffing ourselves. We see that sleeping is good and natural here in Proverbs, and yet we also understand that it can be abused. If a person were to spend all of their time sleeping, which I love my afternoon nap on Sunday if I can get one, I can't do that every day, and neither can anybody who needs to provide for a family or anything like that. You can go on and you can even think about intimate pleasure. That's good and natural, but that too is often abused. I'll be honest, God has set very clear boundaries even on that activity. And I thought about 1 Corinthians 7:2 as I think about how people are being conformed to this world. 1 Corinthians 7:2, Paul tells the church there in Corinth, "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication," and this is important, "let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." The Bible doesn't teach that relationship or the activities in that relationship in any way are bad or dirty or shameful. I've heard people preach such things. The Bible doesn't teach any of that. What the Bible does is it says that activity is perfectly acceptable and good within a certain confine. And so what we understand is this activity is limited to those without a spouse. Now you think about the world around us today, they would tell you that you're very limited in your scope, but this verse condemns the agenda that we see being pushed on many of our youth today, that that a person could marry a person of the same sex, or that a person can live with or have a relationship with somebody that they're not married to yet. And so we understand that God has placed a limitation on all these things pertaining to the human body. Now, we have a second category, the lust of the eye. It's really wanting things that the eye can see. This has become a very serious issue. I actually came across a new article as I was studying for this sermon, and I was hoping the results got better, but it didn't. Matter of fact, it's I think getting worse and worse. According to a study that was just released recently, and this is sad, the study showed that 66% of men that were polled this year in 2016 admitted to viewing inappropriate material monthly. But here's the worst part. The statistics for men who were 18 to 40 that admitted it is now up to 85% who say they do it weekly. And the numbers were actually very similar for women. The numbers are continuously rising. Every time they do a poll, they get worse and worse and worse. And the problem is, unfortunately, that our digital age has really added to this lust of the eye. It's actually made it easy for someone to hide this activity. And yet, Jesus has made this very clear. Listen to Matthew 5:28. "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." We as Christians have to be very careful not to conform to the standards of the world. Many believe that happiness is found in the things that they can buy. Now, certainly the idea is if I see it, I want to have it. And I began to think a little bit about that because, as Christians, and we just had a study led by John, as Christians, we're to assure that we don't live beyond our means and that if we have a financial obligation that we're able to take care of it. Listen to Romans 13:8. "Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." So there are a number of areas where people lust with their eyes. Again, that's the second category. The third category would be the pride of life. This really boils down to people wanting to impress other people, wanting to be noticed by other people, wanting to be admired by other people. And I begin to think a little bit about areas I've seen this affect people in the church. I thought a little bit about education and people spending a lot of time, for example, maybe pursuing after educational degrees. And let me say real quick, I'm not opposed at all. I'm not to education. I think everybody should be educated, as I mentioned before. But for some of these people, the goal is simply to impress other people, right? It's not to necessarily get a better job or to be educated in and of itself. I've seen a lot of people do that, chase after a number of degrees, in essence become professional students. And I've seen it actually affect some of their families because they spend so much time away from their family. I've seen it in the church where those in the business world have been affected, and not only their families, because they were pursuing after, making the next step in the business world or starting a business. And again, I'm not opposed at all to anybody being successful. Here's what I'm talking about. In all of these different things where you begin to talk about the pride of life, our question is the activity that I'm pursuing after, is it simply so I can be admired by other people? And if I am involved in these types of activities, what is the effect on my family? Am I drawing myself away from my family? Am I missing service because of the activity that I'm involved in? The list would go on and on and on. Now, Jesus in John 5:44 said, "How can ye believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only?" I think he sums it up better than I could ever try to sum it up. There are those who are seeking honor from the people around them, when what they need to be doing is actually seeking honor from God himself. That's how you justify if your behavior that you're involved in is really due to the pride of life. Now, I want you to consider how the world has affected some Christians. Listen to Luke 8:14. "And that which fell among thorns are they, which, when they have heard, they go forth, and are choked with cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and they bring no fruit to perfection." Well, just as thorns can choke out a good plant, what we see here is that the world can actually choke out a believer's spiritual life. And I thought a little bit about this. It's interesting. I love vegetables, but since I left the farm, I've never gardened again, ever. I mentioned to you guys I've never cut wood again since I left, but my dad made me go out almost every morning and hoe. We had a huge garden. Hoe every day. Had a hoe. And the reason is because if you don't do that, they choke out the plants, right? The reason for him making me do that, there was a purpose behind it. Sometimes I don't think we realize that the reason that we get rid of, in essence, I'll call them the weeds around us, is because it can literally choke us out. And the thing, though, is to remove these weeds sometimes involves a lot of work. But now I began to see why I had to do what it was that I did. Then I began to think a little bit about anxiety. You've got those who are Christians who have a lot of anxiety about their physical needs. But as I began to think about that, that's really indicative of somebody with a little faith. We understand that God will provide for us when we're living and doing according to his will. Listen to Matthew 6:30 through 33. "Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, What shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of these things." Notice this last part, though, in verse 33. "But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." If somebody's living according to God's will, they'll be doing the things that they ought to be doing, and they ought to have confidence that they're going to be provided for. And so instead of worrying about a number of these things that are taking place, and let's be honest, we get worried about a number of things occurring around us in the world. Instead of worrying about all those things, which to be honest we really have no control over, we think we do, but we don't, we need to be worried about spiritual things. I don't use this passage as often as I should, but I'll be honest with you, it is one of my favorites. I'm going to read from Philippians 4:6 through 8. Paul again summarizes, and I'd much rather allow his words to summarize this position than me to try to fully explain it. This is what he tells the church there in Philippi. He says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." Notice this part. "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things." If we as followers of Christ would really put that last part there, starting in verse 8, Philippians 4:8, if we'd really put that into effect, I assure you we'd be nothing like the world, would we? We would be totally different than the world. The riches of life oftentimes choke out the spiritual life of many. And many have actually deceived themselves into thinking that they're serving the right master when in reality they're not. You think about how easy it is for someone today to become a slave to making money, or to having a good life. They want some of the better things in life. They want to excel. You sometimes hear it referred to as, how many of you have heard it called the American dream? Is there a difference between the American dream and the Christian's goal? Sometimes there is. As I mentioned this morning, when we die, we can't take any of that dream that they call the American dream with us. And what happens is when people forget that, without noticing it, oftentimes they can become covetous and actually idolaters. And that might sound kind of harsh. Notice what Paul warns the church there in the Colossian church, Colossians 3:5. He says, "Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth." And he lists some things: fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So you begin to think about the early church and even the church today and how we're affected by all of these different sins. Wanting things can lead to greed. And when you begin to think about greed is very destructive in the end. Notice 1 Timothy 6:9 and 10, when Paul writes to Timothy. He says, "But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." Paul doesn't say that having money is sinful. Paul doesn't say that being successful in life is sinful. What Paul says is the love of money is the root of all evil. One can have the love of Christ and still have a lot of money and be okay. But there are those who would put money above their relationship with God. And so many are simply choked by the pleasures of this life and the temptations in this life. And that brings me to a few more verses. I want you to notice a warning here in 2 Timothy 2:4. "No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier." Now the next passage I'm going to read from Hebrews 11:25. It's a passage I think that all of you are familiar with. It really talks about Moses as a follower of God, but certainly it would apply to us as Christians also. Hebrews 11:25 says, "Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season." Not to say that everything out in the world is sinful, but I'm also not saying that it's all okay. Moses here chose to suffer with God's people. 1 Timothy 5:6, again we see this warning here. "But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth." That unfortunately has happened to a lot of people out in the world today, and they don't even realize it. Now let me give you a biblical example of somebody who conformed to the world. I think whenever we have biblical examples, it's best to look at them. I can try to explain using verses, but sometimes a biblical example really does a much better job. I'm going to read 2 Timothy 4:10. Again, this is, I think, a passage most of you are familiar with. Remember old Demas. Paul says, "For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens, Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia." We don't get a whole lot of information about Demas here. What we do understand is it appears that he's, for whatever reason, conformed to the world. And because of that, he left Paul. Here's the point. You know, there are pleasures that are wrong because God has declared them to be wrong. There are pleasures in this life that are not wrong at all when they're within the confines of God's Word. Listen to 1 Peter 4, 3 and 4. He says, "For the past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you." What we understand here very clearly is that we're going to be unusual to those around us who are involved in these activities when we're not involved in these activities. That's oftentimes the pressure that causes somebody to conform to the world. If you'll recall, I said a few weeks ago, people often associate peer pressure to the youth. Peer pressure is not a youth problem. It's a people problem. And it happens all the way from our veriest little ones up until the very end when even we're getting close to that time to leave this world. Peer pressure has caused a lot of people in a number of ways to conform. I began to think about how different we are as Christians than we were before we were Christians. There was a movie that I used to love to watch. I won't tell what it was because it's really not an appropriate movie. I thought about the movie. I hadn't seen it in a number of years, and I couldn't remember anything in and of it that was, by memory, that was inappropriate. And so I began to watch it. This has probably been a year or two ago. I began to watch it, and I only made it about 3 minutes. And the language, there was nothing inappropriate as far as visually, but the language was so bad, and I don't know how I forgot that I finally had to shut it off. You know, when we become Christians, what we thought used to be okay, I think we realize pretty quick isn't okay, right? And sometimes I think we actually forget how different we were before we were Christians. And so I began to think about the world around us and how it affects us. Think about this for just a minute. How many of you would want your children to go out into the streets and eat out of the garbage cans? It's kind of actually a pretty disgusting thought, right? Or how many of you would actually be willing to drag the garbage cans into your own house and let your kids eat out of them? My point is there's so much garbage coming into our house. It's gotten so bad that there's almost a lot of things you can't even watch on TV, right? You've got to monitor everything that you see, everything that's on. And I thought about how society is trying to get us to look upon sinful activities like they're actually not a problem. And as I thought about this even today, there's a person that I see on social media. She's constantly posting Bible verses. Constantly. I'd say 50% of what she posts is Bible related. But here's the interesting thing. The other 50% that she posts is full of profanity and condones things like abortion, and the list would go on. And why do I bring that up? I bring it up because society has caused her in her mind to think that she can draw a line between her faith and what the world considers to be acceptable or not acceptable. She's been conformed and doesn't even know it. And the sad thing is that's what the society around us is trying to do, not only to us, but to our youth, right? They want us to conform, and they want to do it really in such a way as we don't even see it taking place. So there are a number of things as we began to think about the world around us. We began to think about how they impact us. There are a lot of pleasures in this life that are sinful because God says those things are wrong. There are things in this life that inherently are not wrong by themselves, but could cause a whole lot of problems in your life. Let me give you just a couple. How many of you collect stamps? I don't see any hands going up. You think about something like stamp collecting, or you think about something like video games. Those things in and of themselves, and no, I don't collect stamps. Those things in and of themselves, they're not problematic. There is nothing sinfully wrong, maybe a little unusual, but there's nothing sinfully wrong with collecting stamps. But here's the thing. If we get so wrapped up in an activity like stamp collecting that I don't have time to pray, or I don't have time to study my Bible, or I don't have time to go and visit the sick, or I don't have time to live the Christian life that I'm supposed to be living, that activity has caused me to conform to the world when the activity in and of itself has nothing wrong with it, right? Stamp collecting's it's amoral. It's not sinful, but it also doesn't It doesn't do anything as far as my Christian walk. And so there are things in life that we can get so wrapped up in, and it's going to vary from person to person. We have to look at each of those things and ask ourselves, are those things causing me in some way to conform to this world? Now I'm going to give you just another set of verses here, because I want to show you what loving this world actually does. Listen to James 4:4. And I'll be honest, this verse really ought to scare the majority of us. James 4:4 says, Ye adulteresses and adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? And whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. In essence, what he's saying is, if you love the world and you conform to the world, you're God's enemy. That's a pretty straight to the point statement, isn't it? That really ought to concern each of us and cause us to ask ourselves about every activity that we're involved in, whether or not it's okay or whether it's not okay. And I'll be honest, there are some things I'm still studying on where I'm saying, I don't know that I've got my hands wrapped around that. But as Christians, we want to, right? That's our goal in life, is to try and do right. Philippians 3:19, it talks about these people that conform to this world. It says, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. The result is they conform to this world. And that's why we're warned, for example, in Luke 21:34. And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness. Notice this, and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. We talked just a few weeks ago or recently about what that day means. We're talking about the judgment day. His point is this: you get so wrapped up in the world around you, or even enjoying the activities in the world around you, that this judgment, it could come upon you and you won't even be ready for it, right? And so we're warned that we need to be prepared for this judgment. I tell you, the love of the world places us in a very dangerous situation when it comes to God. Those who actually love the world, those who live like the world, they're going to face and reap destruction with the world. 1 John 2:17 describes this. It says, And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But notice the distinction here. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Again, it's a very scary passage in that their end is extremely definite, and it's not good. It's destruction. But then you see the contrast for those of us who are believers, and we see that our end is wonderful. It's good. In essence, if you were to try to break this down for all people, it's essentially this: we reap what we sow, right? We do good, the results are good. If we do bad, the results are bad. Galatians 6, 7, and 8 describes it this way: Be not deceived, God's not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. I'm going to tell you what, if we're walking in the way that the world walks, we need to understand that we're going to have the same results as the world. I know that sometimes even we as Christians, we get weighed down with the simple cares of this life. And I'll be honest, even I occasionally have that problem, I think, just as you do. Yet we've also been warned about not letting that happen. And I'll be honest, and I think you know, this can be a hard life. And it's hard oftentimes for us to not be weighed down with the things that we see take place, the atrocities, the hate, the anger, even the physical sickness that we might see take place with our loved ones. Even, unfortunately, things like his death. Notice what Jesus says. This is Luke 21, 34 through 36. He says, And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness. We just looked at this verse. And the cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. But notice what he says here afterwards. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. The idea is those things are going to happen. We know that. But notice his response on how we're to deal with them. We're to actually pray through these things. The goal is for us to still be found worthy and to found in a righteous situation when he comes back. And so we have to be careful not to place our mind on all the worldly things that are going around us. And I think, to be honest, that's the key to the problem of worldliness. With all that being said, then you may say, well, what exactly ought we to do to try to fight this problem? Again, it's probably best if I just give you a couple of passages. Colossians 3:2. Set your affections on things above, not on things on this earth. It makes perfect sense when we know 1 Peter 3:22, this earth's going to be destroyed, right? Notice 1 Peter 1:13. Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul writes in Romans 8:5, for they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. The whole idea here is again, to make that distinction. I have to focus less on the here and now of this world and focus more on the forever after when I leave this world. And again, I know that can be hard. The idea is really we've got to choose to let our minds be occupied with spiritual things. Colossians 3:16 says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. The idea is that if the word of Christ is dwelling in us, we're not going to have those worldly thoughts in us, right? We're not going to be weighed down by the things of the world. And so, as I draw this to a close, let's ask ourselves, really what I want you to do is take a little bit of a personal inventory. What are you thinking about all the time? That may be a hard question to ask, and it may be, something that's not bad. I mean, are you thinking about your job all the time? That could be problematic. Are you worried about schoolwork all the time, or where you're going to go in your next step as far as education? Are you thinking about housework and all the things that you do on a daily basis? Are you thinking about a hobby that you're involved in all the time? Are you thinking about some type of a relational activity that you like to be involved in? Could be even worse. Are you thinking about things that you ought not to be thinking about? It could be any number of things. Or are you thinking about spiritual things? That's a pretty big question, isn't it? The reason it has to be a big question in which I list a whole bunch of things is because everybody's a little bit different, and everybody's got their own areas that they are inclined to think about. Whatever it is, we have to ask ourselves, am I thinking about spiritual things and being righteous, or am I thinking about things involved in this world? I think I'm going to sum it back up with the same verse that I started with, because the spiritual mindset is the key to overcoming worldliness. Listen to Romans 12:2. Here's where we started. We made a complete circle. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. With all that being said, it's only through our faith that we'll overcome this world. Listen to 1 John 5:4. For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world, and this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. We want to be partakers of His divine nature, right? We want to go to heaven. We want to escape the corruption in this world. And there's a reason why. 2 Peter 1:4, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. I think that really sums up why it is the Christians strive so hard to live the Christ-like life. Why it is that we want to study so much that we can have an understanding of how it is that we as Christians ought to live. So as I draw this to a close, I think each of us as Christians, and I sincerely believe this for those of us that are here, that really is our goal, is to be righteous in God's sight. And with that being said, we understand there might be some areas that we need to work on. And as I draw this to a close and I look around, I believe the majority of the people here are baptized believers, but there are some that have not yet fully learned. So let's very quickly talk about being added to the body, just as we find in the conversion accounts. And I won't spend much time on it. It's a very simple process that we find recorded throughout our Scriptures, specifically starting in Acts chapter 2, the hub of the Bible, where the church comes into existence. Somebody taught the gospel. Specifically at that time you had the apostles teaching. And when they heard that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and they believed that He had been prophesied to come, that He was the fulfillment of that prophecy, that all of those promises would be fulfilled for His followers, those who believed were willing to repent of their sins. They were willing to confess the name of Christ and be baptized by immersion for the remission of their sins, just as Jesus himself commanded. And when they did that, they were added to the body, which is the church of Christ, by the Lord himself, Acts 2:47. If you're here and you're not a baptized believer, I'd love to study with you. Maybe you're here and you are a Christian and you're struggling with this world that you live in, or maybe the effects of the world. If there's a way that we can help you, whether it's to pray for you or whatever that might be, you could simply come forward as we stand and we sing a song of invitation.